That way? The one that says not mute? All right. Okay. Last week we started a new series on Book of James. And in the first part of that first chapter, James jumps into the deep end fairly quickly when it comes to the Christian life. And as part of our field guide metaphor, I suggested that trials are something which are expected terrain in our life. That doesn't mean that trials are good, or that we shouldn't lament those trials, or that we shouldn't feel grief or pain. Instead, James argues that God can use trials to produce character in us, specifically perseverance and endurance, resilience, maturity. God, James says, is not the source of trials, but he is the good and generous Father who gives wisdom to those who ask. As we work through the book of James, the problem is not that James is difficult to understand. He's actually quite clear. The problem with the book of James is that it is difficult to do. James is not writing to a confused church. He's writing to a hesitant church. These are people who hear the word, they agree with it, they say, yes, this is true, this is important, and then walk away and do nothing. And it's right there in that pause, that delay, that hesitation, what I will call a gap, that faith dies. Something is wrong, not at the level of your brain and your belief, but at the level of response. Viktor Frankl, you saw this quote just a moment ago, describes the dilemma we face this way. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Yeah, that should be there somewhere. James sees that same space opening up between when we hear the word and when we do the word, but that there is a gap there. And James is insisting that the gap, the space between these two things, is a space where there is a battle going on. That is, the space between hearing and doing is contested ground. It's where faith either comes to life or it withers away and dies. So James is not primarily asking us this morning and his original authors, do you believe something? He's saying, what happens in the gap? As I was thinking about this passage, one of the thoughts that came to my mind is, why do we even have to talk about this? Because on one level, the fact that something should be done with what you hear seems obvious. And yet, we all know that it's not obvious, that this gap exists for me and for you. I hear something, I know I should do it, and I don't. So, the first thing I want to talk about this morning is, why does the gap exist? Second, what does the gap expose in us? And finally, how do you make it across the gap? How do you cross it? So before we can talk about crossing that gap between hearing and doing, between faith and action, why does it exist in the first place? And James suggests two things. First, he says the gap in our lives results basically because it's our own fault, self-deception. We deceive ourselves. And so he says, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. That phrase, deceive yourselves, how does that happen? Usually it doesn't happen in loud, dramatic ways, at least not for me. It happens quietly over time. we here are people who hear the Bible often, right? We read it, we study it, we discuss it. You listen to me talking about it, and all of that is usually good. But it creates a subtle danger because we can confuse exposure to the Word with obedience to it. It's not that we outright reject what we hear, it's just that we delay our response. We tell ourselves that because we have read, because we have heard, because we have studied, in fact, because we agree with it, that we've actually responded to it. But in reality, nothing has changed. And so we allow ourselves to substitute agreement for obedience. And we use intention as a substitute for actual faithfulness. We tell ourselves things like, yeah, I know that already. Or, thanks, Billy, that was a good reminder. Or, James, I like that. I'll come back to that later and I'll do something with it. We tell ourselves all of these lies, and we believe our own lies. I would help if I could, but then we don't rearrange anything to make that possible. Or we might say, I really care about this issue, but we allocate zero time or money to it. Or we might say, I'm planning to work on that, but we never actually start. Because agreement feels like action in our brains, but it's not. You can live your whole life here in this gap, where you hear something, you agree with it, you think because you've agreed, you've done something, and you have not. You can hear, you can agree, you can even feel moved by what you hear. Because we are serious listeners, thoughtful listeners, but we can be those things and still do nothing. And over time, the gap becomes what might be called a safe hiding place, because we can think, we can analyze, we can discuss, we can feel productive over and over and over without really risking anything. And when we do that, the gap becomes wider and wider and wider. It's not that we're saying no to God. We're saying, not yet. And not yet can last a very, very long time. Secondly, the gap widens when we forget who we are. Verse 23 to 25, anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. I know that some of you do that on purpose, but that's not what we're talking about today. At one level, we understand this to mean that the mirror exposes what needs fixing, right? I have spinach in my teeth, or I've missed a patch while shaving, I have toothpaste on my shirt collar, whatever it might be. But commentators suggest that this is not the main point here, and I think they're right. The real issue is that when we look into the mirror that is God's Word, who does it tell us that we are? And you can respond at this point. Who does the Word tell us that we are? Whose are we? We are the children of God. Remember the phrase from last week in verse 18? Somebody's beeping. Anybody know who? He chose to give us birth through the word of truth that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. In other words, we are the people who have been reborn, the people who have been saved, the people who have been freed from the slavery of our own desires. And in the gap between seeing ourselves in the mirror of the Word of God and doing something, we forget who we are. We forget that our identity is as His children. And so, when you forget that your identity is that you are a child of God, what happens is that your other old identities jump back in. The anxious identity, the fearful identity, the self that wants to preserve, to keep from being hurt, the self that is governed by habit or fear or convenience. So James continues, but whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom. and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. And so we say things like, that's not realistic right now, or I'm not in a position to do that at the moment, or someone else will do it. Because we want to protect ourselves. And so we start to live in the old way, when we do what we want, where we were in charge, we let old habits take over. But when we do that, we lose sight of the Father who is supposed to be walking with us. And the mirror reveals whether we really believe what God has said is true of us, that we are his children. And if we forget who we are, we will not be able to act like our Father, will be stuck in the gap, unable to cross over into action. So when we deceive ourselves and when we lose track of who we are, the disconnect between hearing and doing just gets wider and wider. Now, in these two passages, James is going to turn to very specific instances which expose the gap that we're living in and expose our lack of true faith. First is this: the gap exposes our tendency to substitute words for works. Verse 26, those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Words perhaps are our favorite substitute for action, aren't they? We talk and talk and talk about problems instead of solving them. We explain why we can't instead of why we can. We try to fill the gap with religious language, and we talk rather than act. We explain rather than obey because it's easier to let something stay theoretical. And James says religion becomes hollow when we substitute words for work. Second one is the gap exposes our unwillingness to deal with real need. He says religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. This is not an author who is going to allow you to just read and hear him and let it sit there. He says helping orphans and widows, that's what it means to have faith. To help the ones who are the most vulnerable in our society, people who are trapped, who are beaten down by the systems that we've created. And this is where the gap becomes really loud, because in churches we often reward the appearance of faith because it's measurable, it's visible, it doesn't make us uncomfortable. But actually closing the gap, actually meeting the needs, actually forgiving your enemy, actually surrendering control, actually standing up to corruption and mistreatment of the most disadvantaged in society, that's messy, isn't it? It's costly, and it cannot be performed on a stage. And yet, we do settle for performance, don't we? For religious performance. And James says, that's worthless. You've probably heard these phrases, I care deeply about this issue, or I'm really burdened by this, or that most hollow phrase that I see on Twitter every time there's a gun shooting, thoughts and prayers. See, James is not dismissing prayer. He's arguing that when you use prayer as postponement, another way to do nothing about the injustices right in front of us, then it's not valid. It doesn't work. And we hide behind policies or self-preservation. My mother always used to say to me, or she still does actually, that benevolence is the hardest thing that the church does. Because people will abuse your gift. They will take advantage of your generosity. Yes, it's hard to know whether your gift is just enabling a person to stay in addiction, whether you're actually helping or you're really hurting, and some situations are truly complex. So what we see in chapter 2 is James makes his example as simple as possible. There's a person standing in front of you, and they have no clothes and no food. And what are you going to do? If one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm and well fed," but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? And you and I read that and say, well, of course not. Of course I wouldn't do that. That's dumb. It's obvious. It's simple. The need is right in front of you. It's obvious what needs to be done. They have no clothes. They have no food. And yet, we respond, James says, with words. Words that sound kind of right, but are totally ridiculous. As one person said, this is the sound of faith dying politely. It's the sound of belief that does not act because it's inconvenient, because it'll cost something, time, money, our political allegiance, whatever. And so we rationalize and we do nothing. We offer religious-sounding words and pretend like it's enough, and James is not having it. Faith by itself, he says, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. And you'll notice that James anticipates that there will be people in the crowds and that are going to respond to him negatively. And so for religious people who have grown up with an allergic reaction almost to talking about works, this can be hard. Because James argues that the lack of action exposes the gap between belief and trust. He's not talking about what saves us, it's about what proves that we're already saved. Because trust, James is going to argue, always moves. It risks, it acts, and he doesn't let up in chapter 2, does he? Verse 19 of chapter 2, you believe that there is one God? Good for you, fantastic. Even the demons believe that. And they at least shudder. James takes the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, he is one," the most fundamental belief in Judaism and in Christianity, the centerpiece of our faith, and says, that's not a big deal. Demons can believe that too. In other words, demons can have orthodox theology. They know exactly who God is. They have no doubts that God exists. They have no doubts about God's power, about his control, his sovereignty, and it produces at least something in them. The truth about God terrifies them. But if your belief in God produces less response than a demon's terror, if it changes nothing about how you live, James says, how can you call that faith? And then he says, you have faith, I have deeds, somebody says. In other words, my faith is internal. It's private. It belongs to me. I'm sincere, and you can't judge my heart. And James's response is pretty devastating. He says, show me your faith without deeds, and I'll show you my faith by my deeds. Why is that true? Because the gap between hearing and doing reveals what we really trust. In the gap, we discover whether we trust God with our resources, whether we trust him with our reputation, whether we trust God even when we don't know what's on the other side of the gap. See, we've been trained to think that if we just believe the right things, that we're safe with God. If you have correct doctrine, if you've prayed the prayer or been dunked in our baptismal tank, if you can go to the foyer and agree with the statement of beliefs, then we're in. Nothing else really matters as long as you get those things in your head straight. But James says that's not faith. That's information. Demons have information too. What they don't have is trust. I fear that our allegiance to getting doctrine right has damaged our ability to hear God calling us into the risky life of faith. Because if following Christ is about following the rules or doing church right, I can do that. It's relatively easy. But loving people, no matter what, because they are made in the image of God and because Jesus died for them, that costs me. That's risky. That's hard. And it will lead me to places where I'm not going to be comfortable. And the gap exposes this. In the gap between hearing God's word and acting on it, we find out what we actually trust. God, or our own ability to think and control certain beliefs. The gap is where faith either stalls and dies, or whether it crosses over into trust. And so he will say, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. It's dead. It's not immature. It's not incomplete. It's dead. Because faith that never crosses the gap just remains information that you believe. But it's not trust. It might be belief, but it's not faith. So we've seen how dangerous that gap can be between stimulus and response. We've seen how it exposes us and tells us whether our faith is alive or dead. So how do we move? How do we actually do that? Move from hearing to doing. Let's go back to chapter 1 and verse 19. James says, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. I've called this the disciplines of the gap. In that space, some of us are running like there is no space. There is no gap. So we just hear something and we just start running, and we run right off the cliff into where? We just run right over the edge, and we find ourselves flailing in the air, no land in sight. We said something, but we forgot to think about the something before we said it. And so James reminds us to change the usual order of things that seems to govern human behavior. Think first, hurry up, and listen. Hurry up and listen. And then slow down on the talking, slow down on the anger. You can probably imagine this. Think of the thing that triggers you. It's right in front of you. You know what it is. Maybe you know who it is. And before you let yourself go straight to response from that stimulus, take advantage, James says, of the gap in between and insert listening there. Count to 3, take a breath. Don't you let your mouth run ahead of your brain. And here, in this place, widening the gap actually is useful. It gives you space to make the right choice, the choice that James says will produce the righteousness that God desires. Because you can't control what people say, you can't control how other people act, but in the gap, though you're exposed, there's also power there to control your own response. James gives 2 final examples of how this works. First, the example of Abraham. And this is not an easy story, is it? God commands Abraham to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. The thing about Abraham is that he'd already moved, he'd already responded, he'd heard God's call, and he'd done it. And everything that Abraham believed about God's promises to him revolved around his son, Isaac. And yet God said, sacrifice him. And there's a gap there, isn't it? Abraham hears the command, and then he has to make a choice. Will he cross the gap into trust? He could have gone down several paths in his mind, some of which I'm sure you will identify with. He could have started rationalizing. He could have said, you know what, I know God. He must be having a bad day. He really wouldn't want this. He's not like that. This must be a test to see if I do the right thing and refuse. Or he could have gone into theologizing and say, this contradicts his promise, so it can't be right. It can't actually be God speaking, and I should ignore it. He could have delayed and said things like, I need to pray some more about this. We need to get a small group together and have a discussion about this. We need to seek some other options. Maybe I should fast for 40 days and make sure. The problem was, for Abraham, he knew what he had heard. He knew who he had heard it from. He couldn't understand it, I'm sure, but there was no question about the command or what it meant. And so Abraham chooses to close the gap between hearing and doing, and he obeys. He gets up early, he saddles his donkey, he puts his son on it, he raises his knife. The second story is totally different. There's a woman, not a Jew, but an outsider, a prostitute. And she's in a city surrounded by the Israelite nation, and this woman, for some reason, recognizes, oh, that God, the God of the Israelites, is real, and our city is doomed, and there's a gap. What am I going to do? And so she hides the spies, she lies to the authorities, she risks her life to join the people of God. Notice that in both stories, the movement of faith is not about safety. In both cases, obedience happened in the gap, the place where life is uncertain, where you do not know how things are going to turn out. It's not that these actions added something extra to faith, James says, but they revealed faith to be true. Faith and action, James says, were working together. And this is where our faith often stalls. In the gap, we say things like, I'll do it once I can know for sure how it's going to turn out. Or, I'll do it once I feel more secure. I'll do it once I'm convinced of its rightness. But closing the gap means hearing the word of God and moving. And when you hear the call to follow Jesus, it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean later, once you've got your ducks in a row. It means right now. You can see Jesus' response in Luke 9 to that. And of course, we have a third example that we've been talking about lately. I think this is what Odell did. He had moved, he had closed the gap between hearing and seeing the need and doing something. This is why he was always saying, why not? Because the normal response of us is, why? You have a crazy idea. I don't know what. We got to talk you out of it. Let's take some time. His response was always, why not move now? We know this is a need. We know we can do it. Let's go. Right? James' final image, then, is graphic, isn't it? He says, faith without deeds is dead. When a body stops breathing, when it stops moving, it's dead. And that's the way it is with real faith. When it stops moving, it's dead. Works are not the supplement to faith. They are faith crossing the gap into the world. The gap, though, is where we must choose to live by what we've heard, and that's what makes crossing the gap so hard. Because the gap gives us time and space. Time to think, time to analyze, time to weigh our options, time to consider the cost. And in that time, there are several things that happen to us. Fear starts to negotiate. What if this doesn't work out? This looks unsafe. What if I look foolish? What if I can't afford this? In that time, old habits that we have starts to come back. We say, listen, Billy, we've always handled conflict by lashing out or by running away. Or we've always handled need by saying things sympathetically. We've always handled uncertainty by protecting ourselves. In that gap of time, self-protection feels reasonable. I'm just being wise. I'm just being responsible. I'm just being realistic. And this is why the gap is so dangerous. It's not that we are consciously refusing God. It's that we give ourselves time to talk ourselves out of obeying God. And the longer that the gap between hearing and doing stays open, the wider it gets. James knows this, and that's why he's so urgent. That's why he uses such stark language, why he talks about dead faith and corpses and demons. He's asking us to close the gap, to shorten it, to act sooner, to rationalize less, to move while the word is still echoing in our ears, to live out the consequences of our belief, to obey. So, a couple things as we close this morning that you might be helpful to push through here. First, ask yourself, what do you see in the mirror? Who do you see? Remember, James says, who you are, what God says about you, what he believes about you, what he has done for you. And stop letting your old identity tell you what's real. You are the son or daughter of God, and he loves you. This is who you are. You need to wake up every morning with that reality and don't let go, no matter what happens. Second, I would suggest you ask yourself, what is my gap widener? What's my habit of when I get faced with something that God says to do, and I wonder what I'm going to respond like? Is it delay? Are you one of these, oh yeah, I'll do that. Sounds good, I'll do it later. Maybe it's rationalization. You might say, well, it's complicated. Sure. Maybe it's religious talk. You say, I'll pray about that. Maybe it's good intentions. You might be sitting here this morning and say, I really should work on that, and then walk out the door and do nothing. Or maybe it's overanalysis, thinking about it instead of doing it. This is for you. Name your specific pattern. Be honest with yourself. What do you do in the gap? Name it, and then take one specific step today, right now, to cross the gap. There are things in your head that I cannot see, but I can feel going on right now. You know what you need to do. You just need to do it. I encourage you to take that step. Send the text, make the donation, offer the apology, commit to a break from criticizing, whatever it is. Do it today. So, here we are, standing, me, sitting, you in the gap. Everything that James has said could feel like a big weight on your shoulder. Try harder, do more. If that's your feeling, I want to hear the grace again that James says, humbly accept the word planted in you which can save you. The power is in the word that God has planted in you, not in your determination. Your response doesn't create life, it cooperates with the life that he's already given you. Crossing the gap isn't about proving your worth to God. It's about proving that his life is in you, maybe most importantly to yourself. It's the natural evidence of a heart he has already changed. And here's the thing, the Spirit who raised Christ from the dead is in you today, now, not to help you manage a dead faith, but to bring resurrection power to every area in your life where your faith has stalled. Because living faith moves. And so, may we be a community that is known not for our perfect belief systems, but for our active trust in God, a community that moves in the direction God is calling and crosses the gap.